It's strange how some memories stick with you, no matter how much you try to bury them. I was only 12 years old when I spent that summer at my grandfather's house. It was a quiet, secluded place, surrounded by forests, far from the nearest town. My parents left me there for a few weeks while they dealt with grown-up stuff, as they called it. At first, I loved it. My grandfather was kind but quiet, a man of few words who spent most of his time in his workshop. I spent my days running through the overgrown fields and watching the sunset from the porch. But the thing I remember most was the treehouse. It stood in the far corner of the property, nestled in a crooked old oak tree. I could see it from my bedroom window, just a dark silhouette against the evening sky. My grandfather never talked about it, except to say, "Stay away from there, boy. That place isn't safe anymore." I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. Something about it made me uneasy. The way the branches seemed to stretch toward it, like twisted fingers. The way it sat so still and quiet, as if waiting for someone to climb up again. One night, I woke up to the sound of wind whistling through the trees. I couldn't sleep, so I sat by the window, staring at the treehouse. That's when I saw it. A faint flicker of movement. A shadow passing behind the dirty window pane of the treehouse. I froze. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I strained to see better. But the window was still again. Empty. Curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was up there. So I waited until the house was silent, and then I slipped out into the cool night air. The grass was damp beneath my feet as I crept toward the treehouse, the old oak groaning softly in the wind. I climbed the ladder slowly, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, I hesitated. My fingers trembled as I pushed the door open. The inside was dark and smelled of mildew, but it was empty. Relieved, I let out a shaky breath and stepped inside. Then I turned toward the window, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my reflection, just me staring back through the dusty glass. But then it smiled. A wide, unnatural smile that stretched too far across its face. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. I turned around, expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind me. But the treehouse was empty. Just a few broken toys scattered across the floor and a layer of dust thick enough to coat everything. I swallowed hard, turning back to the window. The face was gone. All I could see now was the dark outline of the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was my reflection, distorted by the cracked glass and the moonlight. But the image of that smile, sharp, deliberate, alive, wouldn't leave my mind. I didn't stay in the treehouse for long. I practically ran back down the ladder, my legs trembling with every step. The wind felt colder now, sharper against my skin, and the trees seemed to whisper as I passed. When I finally reached the house, I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. My grandfather's house was quiet, as though nothing had happened. I crept back to my bedroom, my chest tight and my hands shaking. From my window, I could still see the treehouse. It looked the same as always, dark, empty, perfectly still. I stared at it for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything, to move. But nothing did. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream. I was tired, restless, my imagination running wild. That's all it was. But as I stood in the yard later that day, staring up at the old treehouse, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before. There were handprints on the window. small ones, like a child's, smeared into the dust. And I swear, they hadn't been there before. The handprints on the window haunted me all day. I tried to ignore them, telling myself they had probably been there for years, left by some other kid who once played in the treehouse. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That afternoon, I stayed close to my grandfather while he worked in his workshop. I didn't tell him about the treehouse or the face I'd seen. It felt silly to say it out loud. But when I glanced out the window toward the yard, I froze. There was something moving. At first, it was just a flicker in my peripheral vision, like someone darting between the trees. I squinted, searching the shadows. The wind rustled the leaves, creating shifting shapes in the underbrush. My pulse quickened. Then I saw it. A shadow, small, quick, childlike, moving toward the treehouse. I ran to the door, bursting outside into the yard. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the grass. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Who's there?" No answer. The yard was empty. But when I looked at the base of the tree, I saw something that made my stomach turn. The ladder to the treehouse was swaying gently, as if someone had just climbed it. I wanted to run back inside, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt paralyzed, staring up at the treehouse window. It was dark, too dark, and I could barely make out anything behind the glass. But then it happened again. That smile. It appeared slowly, like something pressing its face against the inside of the window, wide, stretched, and horribly still. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I sprinted back to the house. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving. From the kitchen window, I could see the treehouse again. The smile was gone, but this time, the handprints on the glass were clearer. There were more of them now. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside set me on edge. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The face, the smile, the handprints. I finally sat up, deciding to peek out the window one last time. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the faint moonlight, I saw something new. The treehouse window had writing on it, words traced into the dust with small, deliberate fingers. I squinted, my heart pounding as I tried to make it out. "Come back." I stumbled away from the window, my chest tight with fear. I didn't know how the words had gotten there, or why they seemed meant for me. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint tapping. I turned slowly, dreading what I knew I would see. The tapping came from my bedroom window. Something was outside. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then, as the wind blew the branches of the oak tree, I saw it. A face staring back at me through the glass. The same face. The same smile. The figure didn't move. It just stared, its wide grin frozen in place. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, my eyes glued to the window. Eventually, the tapping stopped. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I finally stood and looked outside. The yard was empty. The treehouse looked just as it always did, dark, still, and silent. But the words were still there. "Come back." And this time, below them, there was something else, a drawing of a smiling face. I didn't tell my grandfather about the writing on the window. I wanted to, but every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words caught in my throat. Maybe I thought it would sound insane. Maybe I knew, deep down, that he already understood. That evening, I avoided looking at the treehouse. I stayed close to my grandfather, lingering in the workshop until it was too dark to see anything outside. I hoped the daylight would keep whatever it was away. It didn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch tapping against the house, carried by the wind. But the sound was too deliberate, too close. It was coming from my window. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But something compelled me, pulling my gaze toward the glass. The face was there again, pressed against the window, grinning. It wasn't outside this time, it was inside. I fell back off the bed, scrambling toward the door, my heart racing. But as I looked around the room, it was empty. The face was gone. Only the faint outlines of handprints remained on the glass. I couldn't stay in that room. I couldn't stay in that house. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, straight into the yard. I don't know why I went to the treehouse. Maybe I wanted to end it, to see for myself what was hiding up there. The ladder creaked as I climbed. My hands shook, but I kept going, the flashlight flickering weakly in my grip. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The door to the treehouse was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The air inside was freezing, and the smell of mildew and earth hit me like a wave. I swept the flashlight across the room. The corner was empty. The floor was empty. The window was... I froze. The face was right there, staring back at me from the window. Slowly, the figure turned its head, and for the first time, I saw its eyes, black, hollow voids. Then it spoke. "I told you to come back." The voice was quiet, barely a whisper, but it echoed through the small room like a scream. My flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move. It just stared at me through the window, its smile stretched impossibly wide. I don't remember climbing back down the ladder. I don't remember running through the yard, my bare feet pounding against the cold earth. All I know is that I made it back to the house, slamming the door behind me and collapsing onto the floor. The house was silent. My grandfather found me there the next morning, curled up against the door, still trembling. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. "Some places," he said quietly, "are best left alone." I left the house that same day. My parents came to pick me up, and I didn't look back as we drove away. But the memory of that night stayed with me. The face, the smile, the way it spoke to me. Years later, I went back to the property. My grandfather had passed, and the land was being sold. The treehouse was still there, hidden among the twisted branches of the oak tree. I didn't go near it. I couldn't. But as I turned to leave, I glanced up at the window. The handprints were still there, smeared in the dust. And below them, faint but unmistakable, was the same message. "Come back." I don't go near windows at night anymore. I don't like looking into dark reflections, because sometimes, when the light hits just right, I see it again. That face, that smile, and I know it's still waiting for me. Some memories cling to you, no matter how much you try to let them go. I was 12 when it happened, that summer I spent in the small town where I grew up. A place where everyone knew each other, where kids played until sunset and the nights were filled with the sound of crickets and rustling leaves. It was the summer I'll never forget. My friends and I were inseparable back then. Lucas, Rafa, and me. We spent our days exploring the woods, making up stories about haunted houses and abandoned buildings. But there was one place we always avoided, the tree house in the neighbor's yard. It stood tall and forgotten, surrounded by twisted oak branches. The property had been empty for years. No one lived there anymore, though the house and yard remained strangely intact. The tree house was a leftover remnant of someone else's childhood, but something about it felt wrong. Lucas was the first to bring it up. "We should check it out," he said one afternoon as we sat under a tree, trying to escape the heat. "No way," I replied. "Everyone says it's haunted." "Ghost stories don't scare me," Lucas grinned. "What about you, Rafa?" Rafa shrugged but didn't look convinced. We all knew the rumors. Voices heard from the treehouse at night, strange shadows passing by its window. Adults dismissed it as stories kids made up, but we weren't so sure. That day, curiosity won. Lucas always had a way of pushing us further than we wanted to go. By late afternoon, we were standing at the base of the old oak tree, staring up at the weathered wooden structure. The ladder creaked ominously as Lucas put his hand on the first rung. "Are we doing this or what?" I hesitated, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach. But when Rafa followed him up the ladder, I knew I couldn't stay behind. As I climbed, the branches seemed to close in, like they didn't want us there. When I reached the top, I pushed open the door. The smell of mildew and dust hit me immediately, and the air inside felt heavy. The hole wasn't large, maybe the size of a manhole cover, but it was deep. The darkness inside it was absolute, swallowing the faint sunlight that leaked through the treehouse's cracked windows. I crouched near the edge, trying to see where it led, but it was impossible to tell. "What is that?" Rafa whispered. Lucas grinned, trying to act fearless. "Probably just a storage space. Let's see what's inside." "Don't," I blurted out, louder than I intended. The room fell silent. Dust floated in the beams of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. I felt like we weren't alone, like someone, or something, was watching us. "Relax, man," Lucas said, though his voice was quieter now. Rafa stepped closer to the hole, his face pale. "Guys, do you hear that?" At first, I thought he was messing with us. But then I heard it too, a faint, distant whisper. It wasn't clear enough to understand, but the sound seemed to come from the hole. We froze. "Let's go," I said, my voice tight. "This isn't funny anymore." But Rafa didn't move. He stared at the hole, unblinking, his face drawn and tense. "Rafa?" Lucas asked, his grin finally gone. Rafa's lips trembled, and then he whispered. It said my name. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What are you talking about?" "I heard it," Rafa insisted, his voice shaking. "It said my name. That was all it took." Lucas grabbed Rafa's arm, and I bolted for the door. We scrambled down the ladder as fast as we could, the creaking wood groaning beneath our weight. My heart hammered in my chest as my feet hit the ground, and I didn't look back until we were halfway across the yard. When I finally turned, the treehouse looked empty, just an old, silent structure. But as the wind rustled the branches, I swore I saw something move behind the glass. We ran all the way home, panting and out of breath. None of us spoke about it again that day. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping on my window. The tapping was soft, deliberate. At first, I thought it was the wind, a branch brushing against the glass. But it wasn't. It was rhythmic. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, my eyes glued to the window. My room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. I couldn't see anything at first, just the shadows of tree branches dancing against the glass. Then it stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to get out of bed and inch closer to the window. My fingers trembled as I pulled the curtain aside. The yard was empty. The treehouse stood silent and still, just a shadow against the night sky. Nothing moved. I exhaled shakily and backed away from the window. It had to be my imagination, leftover fear from the afternoon. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I told myself it was just a dream. Lucas and Rafa didn't mention the treehouse at all, and I didn't bring it up. It was easier to pretend it never happened. But that night, it happened again. The same tapping, 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. This time, I didn't get up. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the window. I could feel it, that same feeling I had in the treehouse, like someone was watching me. I didn't sleep a minute that night. The next day, I tried to talk to Lucas and Rafa. Have you guys heard anything weird since we went to the treehouse? Lucas laughed it off, but Rafa wouldn't look at me. No, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I grabbed his arm, desperate. Rafa, tell me the truth. Did you hear it? He looked at me then, his eyes hollow and scared. You shouldn't have looked back, he whispered. Rafa's words stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about what he meant, why I shouldn't have looked back. It felt like a warning, though I didn't understand it at the time. That afternoon, I made a decision I'd regret for the rest of my life. I had to go back to the treehouse. I told myself it was to prove nothing was wrong, to convince myself that everything was just in my head. But in truth, I felt drawn to it, like an invisible string was pulling me toward that place. I waited until the sun was low in the sky, casting orange streaks across the yard. The air felt colder than it should have, and the wind rattled the branches as I approached the tree. The ladder creaked as I climbed. My hands were clammy, and my legs felt weak, but I didn't stop. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The door was slightly open, just as we'd left it. The smell hit me first, damp wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place. I stepped inside, my breath coming in short gasps. The room looked the same, dust-covered toys, broken planks, and the hole in the center of the floor. But there was something new. Names. Our names, mine, Lucas's, and Rafa's, were carved into the wall, written in jagged, uneven letters. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, and then I saw it. Below my name, someone had carved a message. I waited for you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel it again, that horrible sensation of being watched. I turned slowly toward the window. Something moved. A shadow passed behind the glass, too fast for me to see. My legs gave out, and I fell backward, my hands scraping against the splintered floor. I couldn't breathe. I forced myself to crawl toward the door, desperate to escape. Before I climbed down the ladder, I looked back one last time. Through the cracked window, I saw a face. It wasn't clear, just a pale blur with dark, empty eyes and a smile that stretched far too wide. I didn't remember climbing down the ladder. My next memory was running, stumbling across the yard, my legs weak, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until I was back home, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. From the window in the living room, I could still see the treehouse. It looked quiet, peaceful even, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew something was up there, and whatever it was, it had seen me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake in my room, watching the window, waiting for the tapping to return. And it did. 3 soft knocks. Pause. 3 more. I buried my face in my hands, refusing to look, but I could feel it, that same cold, heavy presence pressing in from the darkness outside. It wanted me to look. It wanted me to acknowledge it. When the sun rose, I finally dared to open the curtains. The yard was empty. The treehouse stood still, its window cracked and smeared with dust. That morning, I told my parents I didn't feel well. They didn't question it. I was pale, shaky, and I couldn't stop glancing at the window. When Lucas and Rafa came to check on me later that day, I asked them if they'd seen anything. Lucas brushed it off again, like it was some joke. But Rafa, he just looked at me, his face pale and hollow. "You went back, didn't you?" I nodded. "You shouldn't have," he whispered. "It doesn't like it when you come back." I wanted to ask him what he meant, what it was, but he wouldn't say anything else. He just turned and walked away. That night, the tapping came again, louder this time. I didn't look. I didn't move. But as I lay there, I swore I heard something else, too. A whisper, faint and cold, just outside the glass. "I waited for you." The next day, I made up my mind. I had to leave that place. I begged my parents to take me to my aunt's house in the next town over. I didn't care what excuse they needed. I just couldn't stay there anymore. We left the following morning. As we drove away, I looked out the car window one last time. The treehouse was barely visible through the trees, but I could still see its window. And there, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a face staring back at me. It was pale and distant, but the smile was unmistakable. Years have passed since that summer, but I've never forgotten it. I've tried to move on, to bury the memory deep in my mind, but it always comes back, especially at night. Sometimes I still hear it. The tapping, soft and deliberate. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. I've lived in different houses, different cities, far from that small town, but it doesn't seem to matter. No matter where I go, I still feel it, that cold, heavy presence lingering in the shadows, just beyond my vision. Once, I made the mistake of telling someone about it. A friend who thought I was joking. "It's just a treehouse," he said. "It's not real." Maybe it isn't. Maybe it was all in my head. But then why, when I look at dark windows, do I sometimes see a faint reflection of that smile? I don't go near abandoned places anymore. I don't look through dusty windows, and I never, ever ignore the sound of tapping, because I know what it means. Some places never let you go, and some things follow you forever. Some memories refuse to fade, no matter how much time passes. I've spent years trying to forget what happened that summer, but the details remain clear, as vivid as if they happened yesterday. I grew up in a small, quiet town, the kind of place where kids rode their bikes until sundown and everyone knew each other's names. I had 2 best friends back then, Lucas, the bold one who always led the way, and Rafa, who was quieter and hesitant but too loyal to stay behind. There was an abandoned property near Lucas's house. At its center stood a treehouse, old and forgotten, perched precariously in the branches of a massive oak tree. The adults didn't talk about it much, but they avoided the property. "Dangerous," they said. "It's falling apart." But to us kids, danger only made it more appealing. I remember staring at it for hours some days. The way the wooden planks seemed to sink into the shadows of the tree. The way the wind made it creak, almost as if it were alive. I always felt it was watching us. One sweltering afternoon, Lucas brought it up. "We're going up there today." "No, we're not," I replied quickly. "Oh, come on," Lucas grinned. "It's just an old treehouse. What's the worst that could happen?" Rafa shifted uncomfortably but didn't say no. That's how it always was with us. Lucas leading, me questioning, and Rafa following along. Before I knew it, we were standing at the edge of the property, staring up at the old oak. The yard was silent, unnaturally so. No birds, no wind, just the faint sound of our sneakers on the dry grass. Lucas grabbed the ladder first, and it groaned under his weight. "It's fine," he called down as he climbed. Rafa hesitated, but Lucas's confidence was contagious. One by one, we followed. When I reached the top, the smell hit me, damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. The floor creaked as we stepped inside. The air was stifling, the light filtering through the cracks in thin, dim beams. And then we saw it. In the middle of the treehouse, hidden beneath a loose plank, was a bough. It was old, older than anything else in the house, with rusted metal edges and a heavy lock that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Think there's treasure in it?" Lucas asked, his grin wide. "I don't think we should touch it," Rafa muttered. But Lucas had already grabbed a rock. The sound of the lock breaking echoed unnaturally in the small space. It made me jump, my heart pounding. Lucas pried the chest open with a grin, but the second he did, the air in the room changed. It felt heavier, colder, like a storm had rolled in without a sound. Inside, the chest wasn't filled with treasure. It was worse. The first thing we noticed was the photo. It was old, yellowed around the edges, of a family. A man, a woman, and 2 children standing stiffly in front of a house. They were all smiling, but someone had scratched out their eyes with something sharp. "What the hell?" Lucas muttered, his grin faltering. Rafa backed away, shaking his head. "This isn't right. We should leave it alone." Next to the photo was a small pair of gloves, like they belonged to a child. They were damp, even though the air was dry, and left faint smears of moisture on the chest's bottom. My stomach turned as Lucas picked one up. "Why are they wet?" I whispered. Lucas didn't answer. His expression had changed, the bravado fading as he reached for the final item, a small, broken music box. It was chipped and dusty, but when Lucas touched it, it started to play. The tune was slow and warped, the notes grinding together like metal. I froze. It was the kind of sound that made the hair on your arms stand up. Rafa backed into the wall. "Put it back, Lucas. Please." Lucas laughed nervously, but his eyes darted toward the dark corners of the treehouse. "It's just a box. Relax." But I couldn't relax. The melody kept playing, and it sounded like it was getting louder. My chest tightened, and a sick feeling settled in my stomach. "We need to leave," I said suddenly. Rafa didn't argue. He was already moving toward the door. Lucas hesitated, but when I grabbed his arm, he followed. I remember looking back one last time as I stepped onto the ladder. The chest sat open, the music box still playing. And for a split second, I thought I saw something move, a shadow, small and quick, darting behind the chest. When my feet hit the ground, I turned to Rafa and Lucas. "We don't talk about this, okay? Not to anyone." Lucas shrugged, trying to act like it didn't bother him, but Rafa just stared at the ground. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't get the music out of my head. The slow, grinding notes replayed over and over, even after I covered my ears with a pillow. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. 3 soft knocks on my window. Pause. 3 more. The knocking continued, soft and rhythmic. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, a branch tapping against the glass, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I forced myself to sit up, my throat dry as sandpaper. Slowly, I turned to face the window. The curtains were pulled shut, but the knocking hadn't stopped. 3 taps. Pause. 3 more. I held my breath, waiting, hoping it would go away. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint, like a whisper carried on a breeze, but I could hear it clearly enough. "Let me in." I froze. My entire body felt numb, paralyzed with fear. The voice didn't sound like a person. It was cold and hollow, like it came from somewhere far away. I couldn't take it anymore. I leapt out of bed, running to the hallway and slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night on the couch in the living room, curled up under a blanket with the lights on. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a dream. It had to be. I was just scared from what happened in the treehouse, that's all. But when I saw Lucas and Rafa later that day, I knew I wasn't alone. Rafa looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, and he didn't say much as we sat on the curb near Lucas's house. Finally, I broke the silence. "Did anything happen to you last night?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rafa looked up slowly, his face pale. "The window," he said. "Something was at my window." Lucas laughed nervously, though there was no humor in it. "You guys are just scaring yourselves," he said. "It's all in your heads." But I could tell Lucas didn't believe his own words. By the afternoon, I made up my mind. We had to go back to the treehouse. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like it was calling us. I needed to see it again, to know if the chest was real or just a bad dream. When I suggested it, Lucas hesitated, but he agreed. Rafa didn't want to go, but he followed us, like always. As we walked back to the abandoned property, the sky turned gray, and the wind picked up, rattling the branches of the oak tree. The treehouse loomed ahead, its wooden planks dark and silent. But something was wrong. When we reached the base of the tree, we stopped in our tracks. The ladder was gone. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just stood there, staring at the tree in disbelief. The ladder was gone, and with it, the treehouse itself. Where is it?" I managed to say. Lucas shook his head, his face pale. "It was here yesterday. It was right here." The tree looked untouched, as if nothing had ever been built in its branches. The grass beneath it was undisturbed, save for a layer of fallen leaves. There was no sign of the ladder, the planks, or the chest we'd found the day before. Rafa took a step back, his voice trembling. "I told you we shouldn't have gone up there. This isn't right. None of this is right." Lucas forced a laugh, but it sounded weak. "It's probably just someone took it down overnight. Maybe the owners finally came back." He didn't believe it. None of us did. I stepped closer to the tree, my eyes scanning the branches for any sign of the treehouse. There was nothing, no rope, no marks, no hint that it had ever existed. I crouched down and pushed away the leaves where the ladder used to be, searching for, I don't know what. A piece of wood, a trace of the chest. That's when I saw it. In the dirt, partially covered by leaves, there was a small, dark handprint. It was tiny, like it belonged to a child, but it looked wrong. The fingers were too long, too thin, and it was pressed deep into the earth, as though whoever or whatever made it had been crawling. "Guys," I whispered, "we need to go." Rafa didn't need convincing. He was already backing away, his hands shaking. Lucas hesitated, but when he saw the handprint, his expression changed. We ran. The entire way back, I felt like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing in the tree's shadow, but there was nothing. Just the wind, the rustling leaves, and the growing sense of dread that seemed to follow us. When we finally reached the edge of the property, I turned back one last time. The tree stood silent and still, but I could have sworn I saw a faint movement, a shadow slipping between the branches, too quick to make out. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my bed, staring at the window, waiting. And sure enough, just past midnight, I heard it again. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. But this time, the voice came too. "I waited for you." I spent that night sitting up in my bed, the blanket clutched tightly around me. I didn't dare move. The knocking came 3 more times, each one as rhythmic and deliberate as before. I didn't look at the window. I couldn't. The voice whispered softly, almost playfully, "I waited for you. By morning, I was a wreck." My parents asked if I was feeling sick, but I shook my head. How could I explain to them that something was out there, something that had followed me home? At school, I found Lucas and Rafa. Rafa looked worse than before, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He wouldn't talk at all. Lucas, though, tried to act normal. He forced a grin and said it was all just a weird coincidence. But I could see it in his eyes. He was scared too. That night, the knocking came again, but it wasn't at my window this time. It was at the front door. I froze, listening as the knocks echoed through the house. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. I crept to the hallway, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. From the top of the stairs, I could see the front door. There was no one there, but the knocking continued, slow, patient. And then it stopped. Before I could breathe a sigh of relief, I heard the creak of the floorboards behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. Empty, except for the faint sound of a music box playing, coming from my bedroom. I ran back to my room, my heart pounding in my chest. The music was louder now, the broken notes grinding together in a warped, nightmarish melody. The music stopped as soon as I opened the door. My room was silent again, but on the window pane, drawn in the condensation, were the words, "Come back." I couldn't take it anymore. The knocking, the music, the whispers. I had to end it. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to go back. The next afternoon, I convinced Lucas and Rafa to come with me one last time. Rafa refused at first, but when I told him about the message on my window, he agreed, his face pale with dread. The property looked the same as before, overgrown, silent, as though time itself had forgotten it. The tree stood tall in the center, its branches twisting like claws. The ladder was still gone, and the treehouse was nowhere to be seen. But this time, as we approached, I noticed something new. The faint outline of the handprint I'd seen before, now multiplied, scattered across the ground. "What is this?" Lucas muttered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I just walked closer to the tree, my steps slow and heavy. My chest felt tight, like the air around me was pressing in. I stopped beneath the lowest branch and looked up. That's when I saw it. The treehouse was back. It was perched high in the branches, exactly as it had been the first day we climbed it, but it looked darker now, like the shadows were eating away at its edges. "We need to leave," Rafa whispered, but I couldn't move. The door to the treehouse creaked open slowly, as though it had been waiting for us. And then I heard the voice again, soft, distant, coming from everywhere at once. "I waited for you." Lucas grabbed my arm. "We're leaving." Now, we ran. None of us looked back. I don't remember how we got home that day. I just remember the feeling of eyes on me the entire way, watching, waiting. That was the last time I ever saw the treehouse. The property was torn down years later, and the land was sold to developers. But sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I still hear it. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. And when I close my eyes, I see the words on the window. "Come back." I won't. I don't know what we found in that treehouse, or what followed us out of it. Maybe it was just a dream, a shared nightmare between 3 scared kids. But then why, after all these years, do I still hear the music playing? Some things shouldn't be disturbed, and some places never let you go. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.